Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade.
We chronicled the distinct memories of our childhood in our book, While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s, which takes you on a notably historic journey through that often forgotten decade. We also want to hear about your experiences during the 1950s. We will feature guests whose special stories of that decade will bring to mind magical moments of reflection, some with tears, some with smiles, but above all, a good dose of laughter.
We would like you to chat with us as we bring to mind the sights and sounds so familiar to that time in history. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Greetings, everybody. We are so glad that you are joining us today. And if you see a little black tail in the back, I have my cat visiting me today, and he's pretty much free to roam. And so he likes to be involved with these fun chats too, Jackie. And so how are you today, Jackie?
Oh, great. Hello, everyone. Glad you are here to join us.
Yes. Hey, Jackie, today's May 1st. You have your May baskets delivered?
Not yet.
Me either. Me either. It's kind of a tradition that we didn't really follow a whole lot of when we were growing up, and so consequently, it's not one that I hold true to in this stage of my life. But upcoming is Mother's Day, and our book is a perfect Mother's Day gift. And is there still time to order it? Go to our website and order it.
Of course. And speaking of website, scrolling across the bottom, www.whilethewindmillwatch.com. And at that site, you'll be able to learn more about the authors, about the book, about our vendors, about the events that we are frequenting, and the 1950s Fun Chat.
Well, what are some of those events we're frequenting? Maybe people don't have any idea that we expand beyond just writing a book and fun chatting.
Oh, yes. Well, we have signings and we have Zoom sessions. We speak with local and groups and faraway groups through Zoom, and classes in schools, book clubs, just a wide variety that we will be happy to be a part of if you invite us. Okay. So then, also the 1950s Fun Chat is represented there. And you can tell us which number this is, Janine?
This is number 86, Jackie.
Yes. So all the preceding Fun Chats you will find there. We have such a variety of wonderful guests. So with that, I will also draw your attention to the upper right-hand corner. There you see our book, While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s. And the cover is a beautiful North Dakota sunset that wraps around that cover. And then you'll note in the lower right-hand corner, there's a little white spot. That is an indication of an award that the book won in 2022, the National Independent Press Award in the regional nonfiction category as the distinguished favorite was awarded to this book. We are very pleased and proud. No, we're not proud. We're just pleased. No proud. So on with our chat.
Yes.
We'd like to introduce you to Dave. Dave Benscoter was born in 1955 and grew up in Pullman, Washington, graduated from Washington State University. He spent 24 years in law enforcement with the FBI and the IRS. He worked in Seattle, North Carolina, Chicago, and Spokane, Washington. Following his retirement from law enforcement, he stumbled upon the fact that apples, believed to have been extinct, were grown in eastern Washington and in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. So this led to his personal search for lost apples, and later the creation of the Lost Apple Project that searches for apples believed to have been extinct in those states, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. So far, the project has rediscovered 29 apple varieties believed to have been lost or extinct. So Dave is married and has 3 sons, 2 stepdaughters, and 10 grandchildren. So, Dave, welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. We're looking forward to hearing about your sleuthing.
That's
well,
right.
thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here.
Thanks. So we'll start with this chat centers on the decade of the 1950s. What are some of the experiences and or some of the people that you can credit as main influences in your life from that decade?
Well, first of all, I was born in 1955. I don't have much recollection of that day, but my parents were a great influence on me. And when I saw that you used a picture of a woman in a cowboy hat in your introduction, that reminded me that my mom was a rodeo queen at one time. It would have been around 1951, maybe 52. And anyway, so, and of course I have all sorts of pictures of her in her rodeo outfit. And then my dad, he was a huge influence on me also. He grew up near Kendrick, Idaho. And I'd go visit my grandparents. And when I'd go visit my grandparents in Idaho near Kendrick, it would remind me of the past that my dad grew up with. For example, there was a outdoor toilet, the outhouse, and they would always remind me this was what we had to use before we got plumbing, indoor plumbing. And anyway, so that was a big influence on me.
Okay, the toilet.
And more influence on everyone who had to use one.
Right.
You know, it's certainly, as I got into researching apples, the days of early 1900s, late 1800s, just really brought me back to the time where, you know, you were on your own out there. You grew your own food. You used an outhouse. You lit lanterns to have light in the evening. All those things that I just take for granted now. My grandfather and my dad and grandmother all had to experience those things.
Yes. And really, even people of our age from that 50s era experienced it too, depending on where you lived.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I was 5 years old before Dad and Mom built a new house, and we got all those modern conveniences. So
would you like me to talk a little bit more about my influences from the 50s?
Sure.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay. Well, in researching apples, I was brought back to, again, my father, and he taught me how to prune apple trees. And he also taught me how to graft apple trees. And that has come in really handy because all of the lost varieties that we find, we take grafting wood from those trees and we graft them either onto rootstock or to existing trees. And what we're trying to do is get those apples that were once thought to be extinct out in the public again.
Are apples the only fruit that you work with, and as far as trying to bring about that extinct fruit?
Yes, people have asked me if I looked for plums or pears or cherries and things like that, and I tell them, man, I am so busy with apples that I just can't take the time to do the other fruits. But I will tell you that at virtually every old orchard that we see, they're homestead orchards. We're looking for homestead orchards that were planted in the 1800s and early 1900s to 1920. And the reason we do that is around 1920, nursery owners were told by the wholesale nurseries that they were not going to supply some varieties anymore. There was too many varieties out there, and so they were going to cut back. And I have an article from an old nursery magazine where they just flat out say, don't order these anymore. They're not profitable. And naturally, they had no idea, but many of those varieties have since gone extinct, and we have found several of them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So go ahead, Janine.
Oh, when people came on the Oregon Trail, did they bring apple tree seedlings with them, or would you consider that many of these extinct trees were just brought in by birds? But how did all those get started?
Well, if you don't mind, can I tell you a little bit about the history of apples in
Yes.
North America? Okay, really, it's kind of amazing how even the history of Europe involves how apples were planted here in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm talking about Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. And in the 1500s, 1600s, there were terrible diseases that would go through towns and cities in Europe. They call it the Black Death or whatever. Maybe every 30 years that would just come through. People had no idea, what this death was all about. They had no idea of the concept of bacteria or things like that. But all they knew, especially in places like London, where all the sewage would run right into the London River. If someone died from the plague, they would throw the person and their bedding and their clothes into the London River. And the people didn't understand what was killing them and why but they did understand that you don't drink the water. And as a result of that, everyone drank hard apple cider. And so in Europe, there were just millions upon millions of apple trees devoted to hard cider, and the people drank that hard cider. Even little children were given watered down hard cider. Now, when the first immigrants came to North America, early 1600s, they jumped off the boat, and here were sparkling streams of water. But the ingrained in them was, no, you don't drink the water, you drink hard cider. And so as soon as these immigrants hit the ground, they took out these bags of apple seeds and planted thousands upon thousands, maybe millions of apple trees. Now, that need to drink apple cider, hard apple cider, lasted past the Revolutionary War, and really into after the Revolutionary War, people started to move into the Ohio Valley and west of the colonies, and they still were planting hundreds and thousands and possibly millions of apple seeds. Everybody knows the story about Johnny Appleseed, which is there's maybe some fiction involved there. He was a real person. And Johnny would go to cider mills and collect seeds, which he would then plant. So again, all the way to the Mississippi, people were planting hard apple cider orchards. And you can use any apple at all to make hard cider. You can take the most bitter apple you can imagine, and combined with other apples, it will make a wonderful apple cider. Now, every once in a while, though, from these millions of seeds that have been distributed and planted, most of those trees don't taste very good. Apples from apple seeds don't taste very good as a general rule. I've heard 98%, 99%, something like that apples would just taste terrible. But every once in a while, you would get a good tasting apple, and you would naturally want to share that with your neighbors. And if it tasted nice and sweet and just was a wonderful apple, you would tell your neighbor about it. and he would tell his neighbor about it. And that's how, in the early days, the apples, the good tasting apples, were went through the country. It was just handing somebody a branch, handing a friend a branch, and saying, "This is a really great tasting apple." And from that, from millions and millions of apples, over 17,000 apple varieties were named. That's a lot of apples, but that's also from millions of apple trees. And by the time 1800 arrived, it was the planting of apple orchards just for hard apple cider was starting to slow. And Lewis and Clark, of course, went on their journey to the Pacific coast in the early 1800s. By the time the Oregon Trail was opened, and I believe it was 1847, people just weren't that interested in hard apple cider anymore. And so when the Oregon Trail opened, there was a fellow by the name of Llewellyn, who he took the Oregon Trail with his family. He had a wagon load of nursery material, and he went all the way from the east all the way to Oregon and planted the first nursery in Oregon. And to answer your question in a roundabout way, no, people did bring apple seeds with them, but more probably to start trees that they could graft to, because apple seeds would take up a small part of, you could put apple seeds in your pocket. Bringing a whole nursery with you, that was really for Mr. Llewellyn, and I think they were probably just planning to graft trees from friends and neighbors once they got to the Northwest.
Were most of those original trees, did they produce apples the size of a crab apple, or did they produce a medium-sized apple? And were they red skin, yellow skin? What varieties came?
Well, first, when the Pilgrims first landed back in the early 1600s, there were no regular apple trees here. The only apples that were growing in North America were crab apples. So we introduced the regular sized apple to North America. Now, when the people came out on the Oregon Trail, they followed Llewellyn, and he had just a mixture, but they were all grafted trees. So basically, the trees that he was selling to people, they were all grafted. So if you wanted, and this was really important to the homesteaders, and why pioneer nurserymen were so important, because you would go in to see one of these pioneer nurserymen. Remember, you're either on a horseback or you're on with a wagon, and you go to Llewellyn. He was the first one. There were others later in Walla Walla, Washington, and but the people, the customers that would go in, they're on their homestead. They want to have an orchard, and Llewellyn, or whoever the nurseryman was, he would say, well, first you have to have a yellow transparent, because yellow transparent is the first apple to become ripe in your orchard. It's a Russian apple, and about the middle to the end of July, that apple is ripe, and it's the first one that's ripe. Then you wanted other apples throughout the season. Some of them were exceptional for canning. Some were better for drying. There were the most important apple was the Ben Davis, because you could put a Ben Davis in your fruit cellar in November or October. And when you took a Ben Davis off a tree in October and bit into it, it was a decent apple, nothing special, but you put that away and take that apple out in March or April. That's a wonderful apple. It is sweetened up during its time in the cellar, and you could even eat that apple into May after all the other apples have become soft and you couldn't eat them anymore. So really, a nurseryman was extremely important to these homesteading families who intended to grow what they eat.
Sure.
And orchards were huge. And of all the foods, apples were the most important, because you could have an apple fresh apple from July to May, and all the dried and canned and things like that, you could eat that throughout the year. Even the bad apples you could feed to livestock. So it was just a super important food for them.
Dave, tell us about how you graft one variety to another.
Okay. Yeah. The way they did it in the old days was they would plant a seed, and apples don't grow true to their seed. So, for example, with a Honeycrisp apple, you can't eat your Honeycrisp apple and then take the seeds out and plant them and expect a Honeycrisp tree to pop up. Apples are sort of like people in that they inherit half of their DNA from the mother and half of their DNA from the father. And the result is, well, in case of people, it's a child who doesn't look like, or maybe looks a little bit like one, but there's a mix of DNA. And that's what, with an apple tree, if you have, let's say, a Honeycrisp tree, and a bee goes over and lands on a Yellow Delicious tree and brings some pollen over, now you've got a mixture of Yellow Delicious and Honeycrisp, and both of those trees are wonderful apples. You would expect the resulting apple to be absolutely wonderful. Well, what usually happens is most of the apples that come from the seeds taste terrible, but you might get one or two in there that are at least edible. And every once in a long while, you would get an apple that really tasted good. So, yeah, it's the way the apple. I'm getting off track here. The grafting. So you have. I'm sorry. Anyway, so if you want to propagate, say, a Honeycrisp tree, you would get a branch from a Honeycrisp tree, and it has to be the last year's new growth. You want to have the branch as young as possible, and then you would take either an existing tree and graft to a branch of that tree. And if you did grafting that way, let's say this was a Red Delicious tree, and you grafted to one branch, every apple that was produced on that branch after that would be let's see, it was what did I tell you it was?
You said Red Delicious.
Yeah,
would be whatever apple you grafted on.
Yeah.
And if you wanted an entire tree, you would plant a seed in the ground, and that produces what they call a standard apple tree. Today, most people, when they go to stores and nurseries, they buy semi-dwarf or dwarf trees. But any apple seed would produce standard sized apple tree, which could get as large as 30 feet. And but you'd plant that in the ground, and in about a year, it would, maybe 2 years, it would be thick enough that you could graft onto it. And where you grafted, that's what kind of tree you would have.
Interesting. Okay, Dave, prior to becoming the apple detective, you were an FBI detective. Is that correct?
Yes, I was.
Are there any, what led you into that line?
Well, I just applied with the FBI. I thought it would be a fun job to do, and I enjoyed challenges, and I had a great time investigating cases for the IRS. I first worked out of Seattle, did bank robberies, moved to North Carolina, excuse me, where I worked a variety of cases, and then finally ended up in Chicago, where I worked political corruption cases.
Ooh.
I know it's hard to believe that there's actually political corruption in Chicago, but somehow we managed to find some. And then,
nice.
And then I transferred. I wanted to get back to the state of Washington, be closer to family, and I transferred to Internal Revenue Service Criminal Division, and that's where I worked for the last. I think it was. So I was in Chicago working cases for the FBI, and but I wanted to get back home, and I had been working cases side by side with Internal Revenue Service Criminal Division agents, and I knew what they did, and I thought I could do that job, and so I applied in. Actually, I called Spokane to see if there was, because I thought Spokane would be my ideal location, and sure enough, they had just lost an agent who was promoted, and so I called the boss, and eventually was hired by the IRS Criminal Division as an agent, and I've loved my law enforcement career. A lot of cases were had to do with drugs, money laundering, things like that, bank embezzlement cases, all sorts of things. But yeah, I loved law enforcement.
So could you back up first? What did you major? What prepared you to be an FBI agent?
Well, I graduated from Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, and I majored. At first, I was a major in business, and later I changed my major to communications. But my major in business was really a help later on, because to get into the IRS Criminal Division, you had to have a certain number of credits in accounting, and I was able to squeak by with enough credits in accounting. And also another thing was in my jobs with both IRS and the FBI, there were really heavy document cases, evidence. I would have cases, maybe 60 boxes of evidence, and most of them were documents. So I was not, when I started looking for lost apples, that was one of the skills that I brought over, that looking through old documents for evidence, and that didn't scare me off.
Dave, can you point out a certain case that might come to mind that you recall from your FBI days?
Well, I'll tell you what, there's a couple of cases. One in Chicago was, it had to do with a judge and some sheriffs and some court personnel basically accepting bribes. But then when I worked for the IRS, one case that stands out is a bank embezzlement case, and that's the one that was especially document heavy and probably had 60 boxes of evidence. And ultimately, all these people either pled guilty or were found guilty.
Were there any cases where you were fearful for your life?
No, I never had that fear.
Okay, good. Because of because you were working with sheets of paper.
That's right.
Okay.
You had to have a great ability to remember in going through all these documents and being able to sort and sift what you thought was important for the case, I would imagine. Would that be correct? Or?
Yeah, that's correct. And not only was it the things you would find, but sometimes it was the things you don't find. For example, a judge, one of the judges that we put away, he never cashed his check. His check went straight into his bank account. He never bought groceries. He never his dry cleaning was never paid for by check. His gas was never paid for with a credit card, and and a check. And so it was like, okay, well, what's he getting? What's he paying for? Groceries and all these other things with. Well, the simple answer was he was getting bribes. And when the final analysis, came out, he was just paying all those other things with cash that he would get as bribes.
Uh-huh.
Whatever happens to all those boxes of documents once the case is solved?
We send them to some magical place. I don't know where it is, but after the case has gone through, the appeals and things like that, they just, I was notified, and they say, okay, box up your evidence and send it to this place. So I have no idea where that place is, though, and I pity the person that has to work there.
Mm-hmm. So it could be put on. It used to be like microfiche, or now maybe it's on. I can't believe it would be destroyed, because it's there. It's out there somewhere.
Yeah, it is. It's out there somewhere, and it very well could be on microfiche by now. But that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Did you ever have to train anyone who worked with you?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I trained a number of new agents that came in, and they would kind of shadow me for a period of time. And I would need to, check their work and make sure that they were doing fine.
Well, your days now as the Apple detective, what has been the most recent discovery that you have made?
Well, I'll give you a tidbit of this because it hasn't been announced yet, but we've actually got a couple of trees that I think are going to be announced soon. We're going to wait for our announcement until all the DNA testing is done which is the last step we do for before we declare an apple has been rediscovered. But this one apple that I'm thinking of, it's just out of Moscow, Idaho. And I happen to know someone who is a relative of a great, I think it's 3 great grandfathers who homesteaded the property. And I became aware of the orchard, went to the orchard, started picking apples, but one apple in particular I was just really thrilled with. And it's a golden apple. It ripens near the end of October. And so what I did was sent it into our apple identification experts, and they are with the Temperate Orchard Conservancy in Oregon. The name of the experts are Joni Cooper and Sean Shepard. And sometimes when I send in an apple, it will take them, they'll say, well, we're not sure. And they're doing this basically with books and with watercolor paintings that are on online. And most of the paintings were from the 1800s. And then sometimes they'll say, well, we think it's this, but we're not sure. Please send it to us again. So the next year I'll send it again. And I think I've sent this apple 2 or 3 times. They're just not able to. And I'll tell you what, I don't know how they do it. There's only 5 people in the United States that I'm aware of who can even attempt to identify an apple. So it's just such a difficult job to do. They learned this skill sitting next to a man who would go to state fairs, county fairs, food festivals, harvest festivals, and they would sit at the table with him and watch him as he went through the books and would do this. And it's just a wonderful skill to have. But anyway, with this apple, I sent it to them. They were not able to figure it out. The next step was to send it in for DNA testing. And Washington State University has a professor who does DNA testing of apples. They have a database of about 3,000 apple varieties. So that would include newer varieties, but would also include many heritage varieties. So I sent in you send in leaves, actually. You don't send in the apple itself. Send in leaves from the tree. And the result that came back was there was no match. We don't know what the tree was. So that apple is, we're going to undoubtedly release that later this year as a rediscovered lost variety. And since we don't at this time know the name of the apple, and that could down the road, I'm not saying that's going to be the apple name forever, because we could, find out later, maybe someone recalls it or anyway, I'm just not going to say that's going to be the name forever, but likely we'll probably name it after the homesteader who first planted it, and then add that it's a provisional name.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Dave, can anyone in the United States send newly discovered apples to Washington State University for identification? Or is this just something that happens in the Pacific Northwest?
Let me answer that in two parts. First of all, the Lost Apple Project encourages people to send us apples, but you have to be from Washington, Idaho, or Oregon. But Washington State University accepts the DNA or leaves from anywhere. So I'll give you the name of the professor. His name is Cameron Peace, P-E-A-C-E, and he works at WSU. And then if you want to send apples to me, which I will then send on to our apple identification experts, my email is dbens23@gmail.com. And what we're looking for again is apple trees planted prior to 1920. And out west, we're looking for homestead apples. So homesteads that were they started homesteading in this area around in the 1870s. Walla Walla actually started in 1858, but people stuck pretty close to Walla Walla because there were still, I'll call them incidents between the U.S. Army and the Native Americans.
So that is near didn't the Oregon Trail pass through there, or is that a different trail?
Yes. Okay. Yes. As a matter of fact, Mr. Llewellyn went right past Walla Walla and stopped at a mission there, the Whitman mission. And I don't know if depends on where how much history you took in high school, but the missionaries, Marcus Whitman and his family and another family, were attacked and killed by Native Americans, and that was very close to what later became Fort Walla Walla.
Okay.
And if you can actually see the trail there still.
Yes, yeah, there.
I've been there.
Yeah, the trail. Gosh, there's a highway that goes over the trail at one point south of Walla Walla, and a very historical part of the country.
So why excuse me. Yeah, one more question. Why is the Pacific Northwest such a hotbed for apples? Does it have to do with the climate?
No, it's all about the history, and the people in the Northwest were planting named varieties of apples, and they were planting them when we had basically the peak number of varieties out there. So when people crossed the Mississippi River and heading out to the Northwest, they had hundreds of different apples that they could choose from. Now, Llewellyn started out with, I believe, maybe 20 varieties of apples, but then he later would order more varieties of apples. There was I've got a nursery catalog from 1913 from a nursery in Clarkston, Washington, the Vinland Nursery, and they carried 145 apple varieties.
Wow.
And other nurseries had large, numbers of apple trees they sold to, not the exact number or the exact same apples, but they would. So there was just a tremendous number of apples available out west, and we use a number of things to determine if an apple actually was growing in this part of the country. The old nursery catalogs, which we can find online. Also, a friend of mine who I met through this apple search was a descendant of a nursery owner in Oakdale, Washington. She gave me not only a list of apples that were available, but also a book that was kind of a receipt book from 1904. And from those records, I was able to learn that they sold about 200 varieties of apples.
Amazing.
And then we go back through newspapers and fair records and things like that. Even Washington State University actually has a separate list that I've added. So I think it's about 600. I think I've documented about 600 varieties of apples that were available to people here in the Northwest.
Amazing.
Dave, can you please give your email address again in case someone wants to contact you and learn more about what you do?
Sure. It's D as in dog, B as in boy, E as in Edward, N as in Nancy, S as in Sam at gmail.com.
Okay, that'd be great.
I'm sorry. It's dbens23 at gmail.com.
Yep. Yes.
And also we have a Facebook page. It's called the Lost Apple Project.
Okay.
We'd love to have people follow us.
Yes. And they could message you there too on Facebook?
Yes, but I prefer emails.
Okay.
It's easier to keep track of.
Yes. Well, viewers, this has been a wonderful education from the Apple Detective. And if you have interest in learning more about the project, or maybe you have a tree that is of interest to you, but you can't identify it, an apple tree, just contact Dave, because he would be a great resource for you. And just to think that his life started in the 50s, and with his interest in becoming detective work and keeping records, and how that metamorphosed from being in the FBI until being the Apple Detective. So Dave, thank you so much for being our guest. This has been wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yes. Jackie, how can you close our program today?
Well, I just want to remind viewers to check out www.wildthewindmillwatch.com. And look below, you'll see a red button. That's a subscribe button. Push that, as well as the blue thumbs up button. Until next time, so we say toodaloo.
Bye-bye.